The silence of the Alcazar of Madrid was thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. In the center of a room perfumed by incense and fear, a 23-year-old woman was dying between sheets soaked in sweat and blood. The air smelled of iron, melted wax, and resignation. Elizabeth of Valois, the Queen of Spain, lay with cracked lips and sunken eyes, murmuring a phrase that no longer belonged to this world. "I am tired, so tired." It was the whisper of a life that had been squeezed to its very last breath. The doctors, wrapped in black cloaks, avoided looking directly at her. They had learned that the death of a queen should be observed with the same distance as one observes an eclipse, without emotion, without tears. Elizabeth looked more like a specter than a woman. Her skin, so pale that her veins showed through, clung to her bones like ancient parchment. The courtiers whispered that in her 8 years of marriage to Philip II, she had aged decades, and they were not exaggerating. The French girl who had arrived in Spain with promises of peace was now just a body worn out by failed childbirths, by restless nights, by a destiny sealed with ink and blood. Official chronicles would say that her death was the consequence of a stubborn fever, but in reality it was the result of an entire system, the cold machinery of the monarchy and the church, which had turned the female body into a battlefield. Every frustrated pregnancy, every loss of blood, every prayer imposed by the confessors was one more chain binding her to sacrifice. It was not the fever that killed her, but the weight of a cross she never chose to bear. In that dark room, among the shadows of the wax candles, one could hear the slow dripping of holy water onto the stone floor. It was the same sound that years earlier had accompanied her coronation. Elizabeth's life had been marked by rituals: baptism, marriage, motherhood, and now agony. Everything in her existence had been a liturgical act, a spectacle for the eyes of men who claimed to serve God, but who in reality served power. In the glassy eyes of the dying queen, two worlds were reflected: that of the court, brilliant and ruthless, and that of her childhood in Fontainebleau, when she still believed that the word peace had something to do with love. No one in that room thought of the girl she once was. They all saw the queen who had to die discreetly so as not to interrupt the monarchy's calendar. Elizabeth was not a person. She was a function, a piece of a larger gear that needed to keep turning. Some religious chroniclers would later claim that her suffering was an example of Christian virtue, a proof of her purity and devotion. But in truth, her body had become a political text. It was the body of the realm, as medieval theologians called it, a symbol of fertility and obedience that had to remain intact until the end. Her womb, her blood, her silence, everything belonged to Spain. While the bells of the nearby monastery rang for vespers, Elizabeth squeezed a rosary of worn beads between her fingers. She tried to pray, but found no words. In her mind, prayers blurred with memories: her mother's voice, the smell of the rose garden at Fontainebleau, the laughter she had left behind when crossing the border. For a moment, she felt the desire to be that little girl again, the one who did not yet understand what it meant to be useful to a kingdom. The court waited outside, impatient for the news. The ministers were already preparing the letter that would announce her death to the Pope and the ambassadors of Europe. No one spoke of grief, only of political convenience. A dead queen could be replaced. What mattered was the stability of the throne. When her breathing finally became irregular, one of her ladies-in-waiting approached with held-back tears. Elizabeth looked at her and murmured something barely audible. "Let them not say I died of illness. I died of exhaustion." It was her final confession, a truth so human that no chronicle dared to write it. That night, while Elizabeth's body was prepared according to protocol, the Alcazar remained in absolute silence. But that silence was not one of peace. It was the silence of sacrifice, the same that precedes wars, the same that still resonates every time a woman is used as currency to buy the stability of men. To understand the tragedy of Elizabeth of Valois, one must return to the beginning, to a cold dawn on April 7, 1545, in the Palace of Fontainebleau. The air smelled of freshly cut flowers and incense, while courtiers celebrated the birth of the daughter of King Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici. Astrologers announced that the girl would bring balance between two enemy crowns, and they were not wrong. From the cradle, Elizabeth did not belong to herself. She was, from her first cry, a political promise. In the French court, where smiles were as sharp as daggers, royal children were not born out of love, but out of strategy. Catherine de' Medici knew this better than anyone. She had learned firsthand that a queen was not a mother, but an architect of alliances. She watched Elizabeth with a mixture of tenderness and calculation, measuring every gesture, every word, like someone polishing a jewel destined to be sold to the highest bidder. Elizabeth's childhood knew no innocence. While other girls played with rag dolls, she practiced how to bow her head gracefully before ambassadors, how to smile without showing too many teeth, how to remain silent at the right moment. Her tutors taught her French, Latin, Italian, and the etiquette of foreign courts, not to expand her mind, but to increase her value as a bargaining chip. Every language learned was one more border she would have to cross someday. Catherine, her mother, repeated phrases to her that sounded like prayers, but were warnings disguised as affection. Princesses are not born to be happy, Elizabeth. They are born to be useful. The girl did not fully understand those words, but she kept them like a bitter seed. Over time, they would sprout into the resignation that would accompany her to the grave. By the age of 8, Elizabeth already knew how to read the faces of diplomats the way others read books. She half listened to conversations about treaties, dowries, and lost territories. She soon understood that her destiny would not be decided by her heart, but by the maps spread across negotiating tables. At 10, she learned that foreign doctors would examine her body to certify her suitability as a wife. At 12, she understood that her virginity was not a virtue, but a guarantee of credit. Henry II loved his daughter in his own way, with the distant tenderness of a king accustomed to seeing his children as an extension of his power. When he watched her dance in the halls of Fontainebleau, with her golden hair and lively eyes, he did not see the girl she was, but the key to peace was Spain, the eternal enemy. He looked at her and saw signed treaties, avoided wars, recovered territories. To him, Elizabeth was not blood. She was strategy. In those years, France and Spain were exhausted by war. Europe was bleeding amidst crusades, inquisitions, and dynastic ambitions. Diplomats sought a remedy, and they found it in the womb of a teenager. Thus was born the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, a peace signed with the promise of a marriage. Elizabeth, barely 13 years old, was chosen as the highest price France could pay to stop the slaughter. Initially, she was betrothed to the Infante Don Carlos, son of King Philip II. But negotiations became tangled, and Spain demanded a more solid guarantee. The girl would become not the wife of the heir, but of the king himself. The board changed, and with it, the destiny of a life. Elizabeth was promoted from princess to queen, but in reality she had been demoted from a person to a symbol. In the spring of 1559, Spanish ambassadors arrived in Paris with a document that would seal her future. Before signing the treaty, they demanded to verify the merchandise. Catherine de' Medici received the message with the serenity of someone who knows that opposition would be futile. For the men of the council, that demand was not a humiliation, but a formality. Elizabeth's body had to be certified, as if peace depended on the thickness of her waist or the purity of her skin. That night, while preparations advanced, Elizabeth played with a porcelain doll her mother had given her. She did not know that, the next day, that doll would be her last refuge of childhood. Her fate was already decided. She would be sent to a foreign land, to an unknown husband, and her name, engraved in diplomatic ink, would seal the end of a war. Historians often write that Elizabeth of Valois was an instrument of peace, but what they rarely say is that this peace came at the price of a soul. Elizabeth's story did not begin with a crown, but with a contract, and like all contracts of that time, it was written with the blood of the innocent. The morning of the inspection arrived with a chill that seemed to come not from the winter, but from the very stone of the Louvre. Princess Elizabeth, barely 13 years old, was taken to a room where doctors, clerics, and diplomats from both crowns awaited her. None of them smiled. All men, all with the gaze of someone examining a valuable object, not a life. Around her, the echo of footsteps mingled with the murmuring of scribes preparing the reports. Catherine de' Medici watched in silence, motionless, wearing the marble face she had learned to use in court tragedies. She knew her daughter was about to cross an invisible line, the one where flesh ceases to belong to its owner. "Undress," ordered the head physician, with the dry voice of one who knows no compassion. Elizabeth obeyed. No one explained the purpose to her. No one consoled her. Tears ran down her cheeks without her trying to stop them. She did not cry out of modesty, but out of the terrible premonition that her childhood was ending right there, in that instant when her body became a political document. The examination was meticulous. The doctors noted every detail: the color of her skin, the shape of her hips, the pulse of her heart. They took measurements, checked for signs of health, and finally handed down the sentence that would determine her fate: constitution sound and fit for royal marriage. With those words, Elizabeth ceased to be a girl. She became the living embodiment of a treaty. That day, while the men signed papers and celebrated the diplomatic success, the princess looked at her reflection in her bedroom mirror and did not recognize herself. Her face was the same, but her eyes had changed. She had understood a cruel truth. In the world of the powerful, the female body is not a temple, but a territory that kings conquer to seal alliances. That scene, as brutal as it was silent, was not unique. In Byzantium, princesses were examined before being sent into marriages of convenience. In the Ottoman Empire, harem slaves underwent similar inspections before being offered to the Sultan. And centuries later, in different forms, this practice would continue disguised as tradition, science, or morality. In all of them, the same idea: a woman's body as the property of power. Elizabeth was prepared to accept her role. Her confessor spoke to her of obedience, of sacrifice, of how God blessed those who suffered for the good of the realm. But what was really taking place was a profane consecration. The princess's body was being transformed into an altar of the state. Her flesh would be the border where France and Spain would sign their peace. Years later, an anonymous chronicler would write, "The body of Elizabeth of Valois was examined with the same precision with which land is measured before being conquered." And he was right. In the 16th century, diplomacy was not written with quills, but with bodies. The monarchy and the church shared the same creed, that the sacrifice of the individual was necessary for the stability of the whole. Catherine de' Medici, though frozen inside, understood that her daughter's humiliation was the price of survival. France had lost too many wars, and its name, Valois, hung by a thread. If Elizabeth's body could seal a peace, then it had to do so. Catherine knew what power demanded. Hearts turned to stone. When the inspection ended, Elizabeth was returned to her chambers. No one spoke to her. No one hugged her. In the hallway, she heard the diplomats toasting the agreement they had reached. In that moment, she felt divided. Half girl, half sacrifice. She wanted to flee, to run through the gardens as before, but her feet would not respond. Something inside her had broken forever. That night, in her diary, a small notebook she hid between her pillows, she wrote in trembling handwriting, "Today I learned that shame does not hurt in the body, it hurts in the soul. I do not know if I will ever feel whole again." But no one would read those words. The following dawn, the sheets were changed, the furniture polished, and the silence of the palace closed over her like a shroud. The princess had been approved, and the world kept turning, indifferent to the sacrifice of a little girl. History would record the treaty as a triumph of diplomacy. But if one listens closely between the pages, one can still hear Elizabeth's whisper, as faint as a breath of air. It was not an agreement, it was an invasion. On June 22, 1559, the sky over the Bidassoa River dawned covered in clouds, as if even the sun refused to witness the ritual that was about to take place. A barge adorned with French and Spanish silks floated in the middle of the river, half in one kingdom, half in another. There, at that exact point where the water separated two worlds, the girl who had been Elizabeth of Valois was going to die for the first time. Not in body, but in identity. The protocol was clear. The princess was to be handed over to the Spanish emissaries completely stripped of everything that tied her to France. Her dresses, her jewelry, her rosary, even the air she breathed inside the boat, would be replaced by symbols of the new kingdom. Diplomats called it the ceremony of transit. In reality, it was a funeral. Elizabeth, barely 14 years old, stood motionless, trembling beneath the fabrics that would soon be removed. Around her, men argued over heraldry and clauses, while she stared at the dark water flowing beneath her feet. In her mind, the river transformed into a deeper border, the one that separates the girl from the queen, innocence from obligation. When the French officials carefully undressed her in a ritualistic manner, Elizabeth did not cry. She had learned that tears were useless in the presence of power. One by one, the emblems of her country were removed. The blue of her dress replaced by Castilian black, the pendant with the French lily substituted by an austere silver cross. Even her hair was gathered differently, according to Spanish fashion, to symbolize obedience. Witnesses described the scene as solemn, but in reality, it was cruel. It was not a welcome, but a purification. The French princess had to die so that the Spanish queen could be born. In that instant, Elizabeth understood that peace was not built with words, but with renunciations. On the other side of the river, her future awaited her. Philip II, a man 20 years her senior, dressed in strict black, with the cold gaze of someone who confuses devotion with control. Elizabeth had only seen him in portraits, and those canvases could not anticipate the true severity of his face. As the boat approached the Spanish shore, she felt a shiver run through her body. It was not fear, it was the intuition of destiny. Chroniclers recount that as she stepped onto Spanish soil, those present applauded. The port's cannons roared in a sign of victory. But no one heard the true sound of that moment, the silence of a girl who understood she would never return home. Her language, her religion, her name, even her gestures, would be disciplined to perfection. That ceremony, recorded in all the court's books, was more than a diplomatic act. It was a rite of depersonalization. In the anthropology of power, kings have always demanded symbolic deaths to create obedience. In the ancient rituals of Egypt or Rome, priests stripped initiates of their identity before conferring a new role upon them. Elizabeth was experiencing the same practice, but without faith, without choice, without comfort. The smell of incense, mixed with the dampness of the river, floated in the air. When the Spanish crown was placed on her for the first time, Elizabeth could barely hold it up. It was too heavy for her fragile neck. The nobles called her Isabel de la Paz, Elizabeth of Peace, a title that sounded sweet and pious, but hid a sinister truth. She was not the bringer of peace. She was its sacrifice. That night, in her new chambers at the Castle of Toledo, Elizabeth wrote a letter she never sent. It read, "Today I have died, not with blood, but with silence. If anyone ever asks who I was, let them say I was a boarder." The wind blew fiercely over the Bidassoa River, erasing the tracks of the barge and of that girl who had crossed over into destiny. On the French side remained her laughter, her games, her childhood. On the Spanish side, obedience, coldness, and the bed of a king awaited her. That border remains alive in history. It not only separates two countries, but two concepts of the world. That of the power that demands sacrifice, and that of the victims who must surrender it. Elizabeth crossed the river believing she was serving peace. In reality, she had been offered as a tribute to an older, crueler god, that of politics. Toledo, February 2nd, 1560. The Alcazar gleamed under hundreds of candles, while the air filled with incense, wine, and hollow promises. In the Great Hall, nobles and clerics celebrated the marriage of Philip II, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, to a 14-year-old girl who barely understood the words of the rite. Elizabeth of Valois, dressed in white like a sacrificial lamb, advanced toward an altar that represented not faith, but politics. Her hand trembled inside her lace glove, her gaze wandering among the shadows. The ceremony was long and solemn. The prelates spoke of love, of duty, of the sacred union between two kingdoms. No one spoke of fear. No one mentioned the 20-year gap that separated the king, a widower hardened by war, from the girl who still dreamed of the gardens of Fontainebleau. When the spouses shared their first kiss, the entire room applauded, but the sound seemed like distant thunder to Elizabeth. Around her, men toasted to peace. Inside her, something was slowly dying. That night, as the music faded and the laughter dissolved in the corridors, the true political act began, the consummation. The entire Alcazar prepared for the ritual. In the bridal chamber, the white linen sheets had been laid out with care. Outside, witnesses awaited the tangible sign that the union had been consummated. In that century, intimacy was a public act, and the Queen's body had to be verified, not loved. Philip II entered the room with the same coldness with which he reviewed his counsel's reports. There was neither passion nor tenderness in him, only a sense of duty that bordered on the mechanical. Elizabeth, trembling, sat on the edge of the bed. No one had explained to her what was going to happen. Her education, so carefully curated in diplomacy, had omitted the biology of obedience. When the king approached, she recoiled on instinct. He said nothing. It was not necessary. The crown did not ask for consent. It demanded submission. What happened next was fast, silent, and devastating. Elizabeth closed her eyes and tried to think of something else. The sound of water in the gardens of her childhood, her mother's perfume. But the stifled moans and the creaking of the bed brought her back to reality. When it was all over, the king stood up without looking at her, adjusted his doublet, and left the room. The queen alone watched as blood stained the sheet. That red stain, exhibited at dawn as proof of her purity, would be the final seal on the treaty between France and Spain. The servants entered at dawn to remove the sheets and show them to the ambassadors. They unfurled them with the solemnity of a banner. On the margins of the linen, the peace between two kingdoms had been signed with the oldest ink in the world, the spilled innocence of a woman. That image, which today would seem obscene to us, was a cause for celebration in its time. Diplomacy had triumphed. The queen had done her duty. That same morning, Elizabeth remained in her room, pale and mute. Her maid tried to comfort her, but the young woman could not speak. Something inside her had been torn away. In her mind, she understood a terrible truth. Her body no longer belonged to her. It was the womb of the realm, the receptacle where dynastic continuity had to be gestated. Her skin was parchment, her blood, the ink with which the names of future heirs would be written. As the days passed, Philip II began to visit her with the regularity of a liturgical calendar. He would enter, fulfill his function, and leave without a word. Elizabeth at first tried to look him in the eyes to search for a spark of humanity in that impenetrable face, but she soon understood that her role was not to love, but to obey. Thus she learned to lie still, with her eyes closed, waiting for the duty to end. Some nights after the king retired, she cried in silence, not from physical pain, but from the certainty that her life had been reduced to a routine of meaningless surrender. At court, the confessors praised her conjugal virtue, without knowing, or without wanting to know, that this virtue was a form of martyrdom. In the official chronicles, the marriage of Philip and Elizabeth was described as an exemplary union, a symbol of European stability. But within the walls of that palace, another truth was hidden. The bridal bed was a battlefield where female flesh was used as the currency of peace. And so the young queen learned that power and purity were natural enemies. That in the language of kings, love is not conjugated, it is imposed. That sex, when it is a matter of state, does not unite, it destroys. The following months were a parade of hopes and disappointments, a cycle of life and death that repeated itself with the precision of a torture clock. A few months into her marriage, Isabel received the news the whole kingdom had been waiting for. She was pregnant. The courtiers celebrated it as if it were a military victory. Philip II ordered masses, ambassadors sent congratulations, and poets composed verses glorifying the young queen's fertility. No one wondered if her body, still that of an adolescent, was ready to bear the burden of an heir. Isabel was barely 15 years old. Her hips were narrow, her bones had not yet finished forming, but in the court the concept of fragility did not exist, only that of usefulness. The palace doctors observed her day and night, recording every wave of nausea, every bout of vomiting, every movement. They did not see her as a person, but as a vessel. Her words were forbidden, her emotions censored. The only thing that mattered was the son who had to be born to ensure the continuity of the dynasty. The pregnancy was abruptly interrupted in December 1560. Isabel woke up in the middle of a pool of blood, with pains that tore her body apart. The doctors rushed to stop the hemorrhage. Her cries, they say, were heard throughout the Alcazar. But the only one who did not come was her husband. Philip II received the news with almost divine serenity. He did not ask about Isabel's health. He asked when they could try again. For him, it was not the loss of a child, but the temporary breakdown of a dynastic machine. Isabel's body took months to recover, although it was never the same again. Something was broken inside her, an invisible fragility that neither doctors nor prayers could cure. However, the pressure continued. The king's advisors spoke of the queen's biological obligation, as if it were a mandate from God. Religion served as a justification. Women had to suffer to bring forth life, the confessors said, and suffering was a form of redemption. But that redemption had only one beneficiary: power. The second pregnancy arrived in 1561. Isabel experienced it with terror. Every movement in her womb reminded her of the previous pain. Every night she feared she would not wake up. The doctors subjected her to brutal treatments, bloodletting to balance the humors, burning poultices on her abdomen, purges that weakened her to the point of exhaustion. In reality, they were destroying her little by little, convinced that her fragility was the fault of her feminine nature. When she finally gave birth, the baby girl, Isabel Clara Eugenia, was born alive, small and beautiful. But she was not a boy. The court, though polite, let its disappointment show. The kingdom needed an heir, not another matrimonial bargaining chip. Philip II visited his wife and daughter for a few minutes, observed them with the same expression he would use to evaluate a relic, and left without a word. For Isabel, that birth was a ray of light in the midst of darkness. For the first time, she held something that was solely hers. She pressed her daughter to her chest with a devotion that no king, no priest could understand. But her happiness was brief. Within a few weeks, the doctors and ladies of the court began to pressure her to try again, to give the kingdom what it deserves. Isabel could barely walk, but the gears of power knew no compassion. The following years were a succession of pregnancies and miscarriages. Each loss was treated as a national disgrace. The doctors blamed her weakness, the confessors her sins. They subjected her to new therapies, concoctions laced with mercury, boiling baths, endless fasts. Sometimes the smell of medicinal vinegar filled her room like an acidic fog. Her body became a testing ground. The science of the time, mixed with superstition and theology, saw the womb as a divine laboratory. A woman's failure was interpreted as a moral flaw. No one understood or wanted to understand that the queen was slowly dying, turned into a biological instrument of the empire. In 1567, after years of trying, Isabel managed to carry another pregnancy to term. She gave birth to her second daughter, Catalina Michaela, but the labor was a 2-day nightmare, and she nearly bled to death. She was administered the last rites twice. When she finally survived, the doctors called it a miracle. She, on the other hand, felt it was a curse. In the mirror, she no longer recognized her own face. Her skin had become translucent, her dark circles deep, her hair brittle. At 22, she looked like a woman of 40, but she was still required to smile, attend masses, and appear strong before the court. She was the queen, and the queen must not show weakness. Isabel Clara Eugenia and Catalina Michaela would grow up without knowing their mother's full laughter. Their childhood was an echo of prayers, tears, and closed doors. Because in the heart of the most powerful empire in the world, a woman was slowly dying to maintain the fiction of glory. The machine of power kept running. Isabel was just one of its cogs. And like any machine, when a part wears out, it is replaced. After the birth of Catalina Michaela, Isabel's body became a ruined temple. Every breath was a reminder of her fragility, every heartbeat a plea that heaven seemed to ignore. She had survived 7 years of failed pregnancies, treatments that bordered on torture, and a loneliness that no title could alleviate. At 22, her skin was that of an old woman, her gaze that of someone who had already lived 1,000 lives. But the court did not see a suffering woman. They saw a tool that could still produce. The doctors of the Alcazar discussed her as if she were property of the kingdom. Her womb needs heat, one would say. Her blood is too thick, another would reply. They subjected her to new bloodletting, covered her with herbal poultices that burned her skin, and prescribed concoctions that promised to strengthen her but only weakened her further. Between primitive science and religious superstition, Isabel was the favorite experiment of court medicine. The confessors, for their part, spoke to her of virtue and sacrifice. "Woman is saved through pain," they repeated to her. They told her that her suffering was a mirror of the Virgin Mary's, that every tear shed by a mother was an offering to God. But what they were really doing was domesticating her agony, transforming it into an instrument of control. Isabel understood this, albeit in silence. She knew that her pain sanctified nothing. It only served to keep men in power. At night she wrote letters she never sent. In one of them, addressed to her mother, Catherine de' Medici, she left a trail of heartbreaking lucidity. "I have come to understand that my body does not belong to me, that even my faith has been imposed upon me. I pray, yes, but not for salvation, but to forget." Those words, had they reached their destination, would have scandalized the entire court. That is why she hid them in the false bottom of a chest, among portraits and blood-stained handkerchiefs. The pressure to conceive a male heir became unbearable. Philip II no longer hid his disappointment. He visited Isabel less and less, and when he did, it was only to fulfill his dynastic duty. In the eyes of the kingdom, he was the devoted monarch, the defender of the faith. But in the dark corridors of the palace, people spoke of his coldness, his indifference, the glacial silence with which he treated the queen. Isabel knew this, and every time she heard the king's footsteps approaching her room, her body tensed in a reflex of fear and resignation. In one of those encounters, as he looked at her with the impassivity of a priest before an altar, Isabel thought, "I am not his wife, I am his duty." She did not say it out loud, but that phrase was etched into her mind like an invisible scar. From then on, she began to fade away inside. In the court, the ladies-in-waiting murmured that the queen had the gift of suffering with grace. That phrase, as cruel as it was hypocritical, haunted her in every hallway. No one saw her pain as a tragedy, but as a virtue. In that world ruled by men and sanctified by the church, the perfect woman was the one who knew how to die in silence. And so Isabel did, day after day. Her body was wasting away, but her spirit resisted with a silent strength. In her eyes there was no longer hope, only a lucid, almost philosophical acceptance. She had understood what many centuries later we would call the paradox of female sacrifice, that power celebrates the surrender of women only when it serves its ends. Sometimes as the sun set behind the towers of the Alcazar, Isabel asked for the windows to be opened. She watched the city of Toledo enveloped in the twilight and thought of the anonymous women who worked in the markets, who loved without permission, who wept without being watched. She envied their freedom, their anonymity. "They belong to the world," she murmured. "I belong to history, and history has no compassion." The winter of 1567 was especially cruel. The fevers returned, accompanied by fainting spells and hemorrhages. The doctors insisted that she must prepare for another pregnancy. Isabel knew that this attempt would be her end. She began to refuse the remedies, pretending to drink them. Inside, she had made a silent decision to let her body rest, even if the price was her life. In her last letter, which was also never sent, she wrote, "I have fulfilled everything that was asked of me. I have given my body, my youth, my faith. Now I want to give myself something I never had, the right to stop." That night, while the palace slept, Isabel lit a candle and prayed a prayer that was not in any book. She did not ask for forgiveness or salvation. She asked for oblivion, because only oblivion, she thought, could free the women trapped on the altars of power. As the months passed, Isabel was no longer seen in public. Ceremonies, banquets, audiences, everything was suspended under the pretext of her health, although the real reason was crueler. The court could not tolerate the spectacle of a queen falling apart. Her beauty, once celebrated in portraits and tapestries, had become an uncomfortable reminder of the fragility of the human body, of the impermanence of glory. In the corridors of the Alcazar, people spoke in whispers. Some said the queen was possessed by melancholy, others that God was punishing her for her sterility. In a society where faith explained everything, illness was always someone's fault. Isabel listened to those rumors from her bed without reacting. She had learned that at court the truth did not matter, only appearances. Philip II, always absorbed in the affairs of the kingdom, visited her less and less. When he did, his words were as cold as marble. He asked if she had improved, if the doctors had tried new treatments. He never asked if she was suffering. Love, if it ever existed between them, had dissolved in the ritual distance of the monarchy. The queen was now a shadow in her own home. But in the silence of her room, Isabel began to write. She filled notebooks with thoughts, reflections, and prayers distorted by despair. In one of them, historians later found a phrase that reveals all her lucidity. "I do not fear dying. I fear continuing to live without a soul." In those words, all her torment was condensed. She had survived the physical pain, but her spirit had been slowly devoured by the machinery of power. Sometimes she asked to be brought a mirror. She would look at herself for a long time, not out of vanity, but out of disbelief. She wanted to see what was left of the girl she had been, but the reflection staring back from the glass was not that of a queen or a martyr, but that of a prisoner. The deep, dark circles, the translucent skin, the parched lips. She touched her face with her fingers and murmured, "Where am I?" No one had an answer. In her mind, the past and the present began to blur. In the delirium brought on by the fever, she saw her mother in the gardens of Fontainebleau, heard the bells of Paris, the singing of the birds over the Seine. She wept, not for the pain in her body, but for the memory of what she never had again, the freedom to be a child without a political purpose. The court, however, maintained protocol. Every morning, the servants opened the curtains, perfumed the room, and placed fresh flowers in the vases. Everything had to appear orderly, dignified, royal. Suffering had no place in palaces. Royalty had to die with elegance. Even when death arrived accompanied by blood and despair, the confessors continued to visit her. They spoke to her of heaven, of salvation, of the promise of eternal life where pain would not exist. But Isabel listened to them with an unsettling calm. Deep down, she had stopped believing. Her faith was no longer devotion, but habit. In one of her last conversations with her lady-in-waiting, she said, "God must be tired of women who suffer. He made us strong, but forgot to give us relief." As her body weakened, her mind became sharper, more piercing. She understood that her tragedy was not just personal, but structural. It was the reflection of a world where a woman existed to be useful, not happy, where female sanctity was measured by the amount of pain endured in silence. She understood that her life was a warning disguised as an example. What happens when a society confuses sacrifice with virtue? Some nights, as the monastery bells marked the hours, Isabel talked to herself, as if conversing with the shadows that filled the room. "I was a queen," she murmured, "but I was never my own master." And she added with a sad smile, "They say I represent peace, but peace does not exist when a single woman has to die to sustain it." That thought stayed with her until the end. It did not abandon her, even in moments of delirium, when the fever made her confuse faces and times. Her lucidity, paradoxically, was her punishment, because she understood too late that the greatest crime of power is not killing the body, but domesticating the soul. And as the flames of the candles flickered, Isabel, the child queen, slowly faded away, turned into an echo of what she could have been. In that echo lay the true tragedy. Not death, but the loss of meaning. October 3rd, 1568, dawned with a different silence, dense, almost sacred. In the Alcazar of Madrid, footsteps sounded muffled, as if the entire building were holding its breath. Isabel de Valois had woken up with a fever that would not yield to remedies or prayers. The doctors went in and out of her room like solemn vultures, exchanging glances heavy with resignation. They knew there was nothing left to do. The body that for years had been an instrument of the state finally refused to continue obeying. During the first few days, Isabel was delirious. She spoke in French, her forgotten language, as if her soul, sensing the proximity of the end, sought refuge in its origins. She called for her mother, asked for water from the Seine, spoke the names of her childhood dolls. It was as if the walls of time crumbled before her. Those who cared for her said that seeing her, she looked like a lost child, not a queen. And they were right. In her agony, Isabel returned to her childhood, to the only place where she was not required to be anything other than herself. Philip II, informed of his wife's grave condition, went to the Alcazar. He entered the room, looked at the fragile, pale body lying in the bed, and stood in silence for a few minutes. He did not say a word. He did not step closer to touch her. Perhaps because he did not know how. Perhaps because protocol prevented it. Then he turned around and left. He never saw her alive again. Isabel, in one of her moments of lucidity, asked for him. "Will the king come?" No one dared to answer. She understood the silence. She closed her eyes and murmured, "There is no need. He was never really here." In the following days, the fever intensified. Her breathing became erratic, and the doctors, desperate, tried to purge her one more time. They applied ointments, bled her, gave her concoctions that only hastened the end. The smell of medicine and incense filled the room, mingling with the constant whisper of prayers. Outside, the court continued to function as if nothing were happening. The banquets, the audiences, the decrees. The kingdom did not stop for a woman, not even for a queen. One night, amidst the delirium, Isabel asked that the candles be put out. "I don't want them to see me die," she said in a weak voice. Her lady-in-waiting took her hand. "Your Majesty, heaven awaits you." She smiled, a slight, almost invisible gesture. "I don't want heaven," she whispered. "I just want to rest." Her last coherent words were in Spanish, the language she had learned to please a husband who never loved her. "I am tired, so tired." It was not the exhaustion of illness, but of a whole life used up, consumed by others. The exhaustion of having existed only to serve, to suffer, to represent. She died in the early hours of the morning as the bells of the neighboring convent struck 3. The servants knelt. The doctors bowed their heads. Philip II was not present. At that moment, he was attending Mass. The official chronicle would say that the Queen passed away with Christian serenity, but in truth she died in absolute loneliness, enveloped in silence, surrounded by faces that only saw a duty fulfilled. At dawn, they dressed her body in the same black gown she had worn at her wedding, a symbol of her submission and of Spanish austerity. They wrapped her in velvet and pearls, but beneath the luxury, only bones and skin remained. One of her ladies, unable to hold back her tears, murmured, "She looks asleep." Another replied, "No, she looks free." The news of her death swept across Europe. In the courts, condolences were sent, masses were celebrated, speeches were made about her virtue and her obedience. No one spoke of her pain. No one mentioned that the peace she had sealed with her life would not last. The chroniclers of her time reduced her to a footnote, a figure in the genealogy of kings. But the truth was not in the archives, but in the silence she left behind. Isabel did not die just from an illness. She died of spiritual exhaustion, of internal exile. Her body was the battlefield where an invisible war was waged, that of power against innocence. In the following days, Philip II resumed his affairs with punctuality. The kingdom had to continue. Isabel's corpse was moved to El Escorial, the mausoleum of kings, where she was placed alongside the symbols of imperial greatness. No one heard the echo of her voice in those cold stones, but it was there, in every shadow of the palace, in every cursed prayer. Isabel de Valois was not remembered as a martyr or a heroine. She was remembered as what power wanted her to be, an obedient queen, a devoted wife, a useful daughter. But beneath that mask, her story screamed another truth. That peace bought with a woman's life is not peace, but a cowardly truce. And so, with her last breath, Isabel stripped bare the face of the monarchy. She proved that even the highest thrones are supported by sacrificed bodies, and that power, when it knows no limits, turns love into duty, faith into punishment, and motherhood into a sentence. Years after her death, the name of Isabel de Valois began to fade from the history books. In the official chronicles, her life was summed up in one line: third wife of Philip II, died at the age of 23. Nothing more. Not a word about her tears, not a mention of her miscarriages, not a trace of her humanity. Power, as always, had done its job, erasing the suffering and preserving only the symbol. But the truth, even when buried, does not disappear. Isabel lived on in the cracks of the official narrative, in the whispers of the ladies who served her, in the diaries that were never published, in the letters that were never sent. Her story survived not because anyone wanted to remember it, But because the silence surrounding it was too heavy to bear, Isabel's death was the perfect triumph of the system that devoured her. Philip II, the prudent king, remarried the following year. The dynastic machinery did not stop. He changed wives like someone changing a worn-out part of a divine mechanism. The kingdom continued to prosper, temples continued to be built, and the church blessed every decision, convinced that the will of God and that of the king were one and the same. But in the corridors of history, a question remained floating that no one dared to answer. How much is a peace built on the sacrifice of the innocent worth? Isabel was the incarnate answer to that question. Her body was the document where a truce was signed, her blood, the ink that guaranteed European stability. And yet her name was relegated to oblivion, because remembering her story would be acknowledging that diplomacy and violence deep down are children of the same father. In the political philosophy of the 16th century, people spoke of the king's body as a symbol of the kingdom's unity. No one mentioned the queen's body, that colonized territory where power was exercised in a more intimate and crueler way. Isabel was the mirror reflecting the invisible structure of domination, a power that ruled not only countries, but also wombs. The church sanctified her in speeches, calling her a model of Christian obedience. But if Isabel could have spoken from her grave, she would have said something else. That obedience without love is slavery, that sacrifice without choice is torture. Her life was a rosary of impositions blessed by men who confused control with piety. In her tomb at El Escorial, beneath cold marble and golden prayers, rests what was once the most promising girl in Europe. Her epitaph does not mention the word pain, only queen, only peace. The ironies of history: the woman who died exhausted from trying to give life was buried under the words eternal life. But her true legacy is not in palaces or portraits. It is in the conscience of subsequent generations, in every woman who understands that her worth does not depend on her usefulness, in every voice that refuses to be silenced. Isabelle de Valois did not die in the 16th century. She dies every time a woman is used as an instrument, and is reborn every time one refuses to be. The echo of her story echoes through the centuries like a warning. It reminds us that societies change in form, but not always in nature. Even today, bodies continue to be a territory of dispute. Decisions are still conditioned by invisible hierarchies, and the idea of peace is still built on imposed silences. If you ever visit El Escorial and walk through its gloomy corridors, you might feel a chill. It is not the ghosts of kings, but the breathing of those who died without being able to tell their own stories. Among them, Isabel's voice continues to murmur in the cracks of the marble. My peace was not that of men, it was that of oblivion. And perhaps therein lies her true victory, that her story, rewritten in whispers, forces us to look at the past without romanticism, to understand that every treaty, every alliance, every golden cross erected over history is stained with the blood of those who had no choice. Isabelle de Valois was more than a queen. She was a mirror reflecting all the systems that sacrifice the weak in the name of stability. She was a boundary, a warning, an open wound that history tried to close with marble and silence. And although power may have tried to bury her voice, her echo still endures, reminding us of what time should never erase. That a peace built on a woman's body is not peace, it is an elegant form of barbarism.